So thank you all so much for joining us today. Today's panel is looking at how renewable energy can accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Just transition and also inclusion. My name is Sephora Berman. I'm the International Program Director at Stand.Earth and also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and I'll be your moderator for today. So before I turn to our guests, I want to flag a couple of issues in context. We all know here at COP26 that it is urgent that we stop the expansion and wind down fossil fuel production and emissions. For years, we've been working to increase renewable energy systems in order to ensure energy access, security, and a stable climate. But the fact remains that 10 years ago, the world was using 80% fossil energy. And despite drops in the price of renewables, the dramatic advances we've seen in technology, and many country commitments, today 80% of the world's energy use is fossil fuel energy. So no change in a decade. How can this be? One factor holding us back is obviously the fossil fuel industry and a lack of accountability and transparency on fossil fuel production and reserves, and commitments from nations for international cooperation to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. Already today, we've heard that countries here at COP26 are beginning to really move forward in understanding that we need to not only reduce emissions and have emissions targets, but also address the production of fossil fuels. But it's this reason that thousands of scientists now and over 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, as well as parliamentarians from 24 countries, are pursuing the bold idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which highlights both the need to stop expansion and equitably phase out fossil fuels while simultaneously ensuring a just transition to renewable energy and economic diversification. But a first concrete step is work of a group of energy experts and academics that are led by Carbon Tracker and the Global Energy Monitor to develop the first ever global registry of fossil fuel production and reserves, a prototype of which will be released here next week at COP26. So the challenges in front of us are significant. If we're going to meet our shared goals, we need to scale up renewable energy in a way that ensures justice and equity. We must also work together to support countries, especially in the global south, in managing a decline of fossil fuel production and emissions, and ensuring that as we do this transition, no worker or their family are left behind. So today we have an incredible panel, 3 panelists who are going to help us explore these issues, understand how the transition to renewables can support other sustainable development objectives, and ensure real inclusion in the process. Ms. Irene Karani is the African Director for the Children Investment Fund Foundation. Mr. Ben Backwell is the General Secretary of GWEC. Her Excellency Beathe Kristiansen Tvinnereim is the Minister of International Development for Norway. So Irene, can we start with you? As the African Director for the Children Investment Fund Foundation, you've been deploying philanthropy initiatives for just transition in Africa. Can you describe your experience in balancing this work with the need for energy access in the first place? In your experience, what are the key factors for success for just transition initiatives in the region?
Thank you very much, Zipporah. And as you rightly said, there's need to balance the energy access and the just transition pathway. So we've been working with South Africa through our partner, the Africa Climate Foundation, and working with the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa for this work. And this has led to the big announcement that they did just the other day of where they are going to crowd in funding of 8.5 billion euro for a just transition out of coal into other renewables in South Africa. Now, coal is the biggest energy source in South Africa, and you can imagine the livelihoods have been built around mining coal. And there are about 92,000 people employed in the mining industry in coal. And the question is, when they transition out to renewables, what happens to the lives and the jobs of these 92,000 people? So a lot of them may be elderly, but then we have a huge youth group that is employed in this industry. And the thing is that the coal mining has been generational. So it has crowded out other types of livelihood that could have occurred had it, could have diversified the livelihoods of these people. So we have to now turn back the clock. There will be no coal in future. And the idea is to really bump up other industries, green industries, through the exploitation or the development of green hydrogen, which will drive industries like for e-mobility, and then reskill these people who will be out of jobs in the future. And we're also looking at other issues like regenerative agriculture, which could take place but has not taken place because everybody has been engaged in coal. So we are looking at diversified livelihoods. We are looking at green industrialized, the green industrialized sector in the future. And in this way, we are hoping, but we are not going to do this alone. We need the help of the government, of civil society, of businesses, because the entire value chain is going to be disrupted. And on top of that, social innovation will play a very key role in transitioning these people out of coal and into a green economy.
Thank you so much, Irene. A question for you, Ben. You lead an association of companies that's accelerating production of wind energy. Some of these companies also have fossil fuel interests and are at the front lines of the fossil fuel phase out. What policies do you think we need to speed up the transition while ensuring that it's a just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sephora. So I lead GWEC, which groups together the global wind industry, both companies and also associations around the world. So we're truly global. We work across all the different continents in dozens of countries. The transition is happening, as we all know. It's happening at a fairly brisk pace, but it's not happening fast enough. And what's happened is that very, very ambitious targets have now been set by the international energy organizations. We're hoping that here at COP, commitments from countries will come into line with those net zero scenarios. But we're a very, very long way from deploying the amount of renewable energy that we need on the ground to make that happen. And I just want to be perfectly honest with everyone here. I mean, we installed last year 93 gigawatts of wind energy, which is our best year ever. But if you are consistent with the Irene World Energy Transitions Outlook or the IEA Net Zero by 2050, we would need to be installing about 3 to 4 times as much on an annual basis, because the requirement, according to those scenarios, is for 8 terawatts of wind energy by 2050, 2 gigawatts of which is offshore. So things need to go a lot faster. And there's, I'll just pick out 3 things. I mean, first of all, we need a stronger push factor. So how do you push off the incumbent fossil fuels off the system? Because in many places, what happens is we have auctions now for new renewable power. And in many places, we're the fastest source of new power, but we're still doing fossil fuels because we simply can't go fast enough to supply all the new energy needs. So in an overall sense, emissions continue to rise because we're just not going fast enough. So more ambitions needed, but then you go into regulatory and everything's just too slow. I mean, it takes, even in the best cases, it takes 10 years to do an offshore wind project, not because of the construction. I mean, you can construct a project in a year or 2, but permitting, licensing, getting auctions ready, all those things just take a really, really long time. And in many cases, there's kind of stop-go kind of processes, people delay, prevaricate, and so on and so on. And we're really getting to the point where that can't happen anymore. We can't just talk about renewables as if it's going to happen. we know as an industry it's not happening on the ground at the right pace. And I mean, my colleagues in the solar industry will tell you the same thing. It's not just wind. Wind and solar together are 70% of the electricity system that will be needed in 2050. So it's the two sources of energy that are going to be the backbone of the electricity system, and also wider decarbonisation through things like green hydrogen. So the really kind of less interesting things, perhaps for many people, like permitting and market design, really need to be addressed on a very urgent basis. And then I know I've probably gone a bit too long. Maybe should I come back to the just transition?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I mean, we are creating jobs very rapidly. We're about just under 1 million jobs at the moment. We think that just with the kind of good business as usual case, we will create another 3.3 million direct jobs in the next 4 years. So we're creating a lot of jobs, but again, that's on the kind of good business as usual trajectory. If we were on the actual net zero trajectory and we were consistent with what Irene knows is necessary, we would be creating far, far, far many jobs. And then if I could just say one comment, I mean, we need to create a more, a skilled workforce. We need to create a younger workforce. We need a diverse workforce, and one that has gender equality and balance at its center. And we need to make sure that no one is left behind, and that skilled jobs are not concentrated just in privileged countries or in privileged regions or in privileged parts of companies. We really need this to be different. And I think we can go on to this, but we need to take people with us, and we need people's support. And we're only going to do that if people feel they have a stake in things. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ben. So a question for you, Minister. Could you tell us about Norway's experience with the just transition, the issues that you've faced in discussion with the workforce? How are you, or have you resolved them?
If we are to succeed, and we must succeed, we need to make sure that people are on board. And if people are scared that they would lose their jobs, it's not going to work. We're not going to be able to drive this forward. And the experience from Norway is, politicians like me, we tend to want to get re-elected. And now if the voters say, no, we can't go on board on this because we're going to lose our jobs, then we won't, as politicians, won't succeed in calming them down, saying that we need this green transition, and it's going to, it's for the benefit of us all. So that's why the inclusive transition is so important. And the Norwegian example is, we have a big petroleum sector, and that has created a huge discussion. What's going to happen to our jobs? Now, my message is that when that sector was built up in the 70s, that was on the shoulders of a sector that was already there. The wharfs, the fisheries sector, etc. The technologies that we were already had invested in, and the skills that were already there. Mm-hmm. My message is that the new green transition, the green technology, will be built on the skills of highly skilled people from the petroleum sectors that will transition into new green technologies. And my job as a politician is to make sure that that message comes through, because I'm absolutely positive that that is the direction we're headed in. And that also means that the state has to invest. I don't think the market may not do this quickly enough. So as a government, you must put resources ahead and invest directly in making that transition quicker. And as a development minister, I think that lesson is the same that we should transfer to the rest of the world and development countries, because we need a lot of jobs. And the thing with the renewable energy sector is that it creates a lot of jobs, more jobs than the old fossil sector. And the whole circular economy has the potential of creating a lot more jobs than the linear economy that we have today. So we just need to get that wheel running with willing hands and public money.
Absolutely. And I think your point about investment is really critical around public investment. One of the things that I've been noticing is that when you look at the future of renewable energy and electrification, the infrastructure that's required is often a public spend. The transmission grids, the upgrades, that we need. Whereas the fossil system is often a big private spend. New pipelines being proposed, et cetera. That puts a significant onus on public spending for infrastructure. Is that something that has been challenging for the government as you look forward to that transition?
Yes, I think you're quite right, and I think we need to think differently about the private-public partnership on that take, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now maybe a hard question, not sure. But a couple of weeks ago, the IMF put out a report on fossil fuel subsidies. And I know that there is significant debates around the world on what's considered a tax break and what's considered a subsidy. Their report said that fossil fuel subsidies right now globally are about $11 million a minute. I found that a very shocking figure, $11 million a minute. And been encouraged to hear commitments to reducing fossil fuel subsidies. Can you tell us a little bit about your trajectory on that issue?
Well, we are committed to reducing fossil fuel subsidies. It is tricky. It is politically extremely difficult, but it's also critical. And I think tax systems and subsidies, they tend to freeze. What I see is that if we at least could make sure that the renewable energies get sort of the same a level playing field, I mean, that would take us a long way. But yes, Norway is committed to reducing fossil subsidies.
Fantastic. Now, Ben, you talked about the scale that's required in both wind and solar and how we're really not there yet. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what's holding us back. Because I think I often hear that it's, we're waiting for this technological breakthrough or that technological breakthrough, except what we're seeing in the case of wind and solar is that it is now cost competitive, if not cheaper in a lot of countries, and that we have the technology for large scale. So what in your opinion, is holding us back?
Yeah, it's Thursday afternoon, it's Energy Day, so maybe I can be a bit controversial, and I've been on quite a few panels kind of violently agreeing with people, so let's try and create a bit of controversy. I mean, quite simply, it's all talk in most places. I mean, things don't happen on the ground. There's many examples where countries have moved forward very quickly, but there's many others where they've been talking for years and years and years, or they start to do some renewables and then backtrack. There's still very strong vested interests from fossil fuel in many countries. There's a regulatory frameworks that take years and years to devise because of bureaucratic red tape. And then there's huge bureaucracy around planning and permitting that means everything takes decades. And we can't afford this anymore. So, I mean, as you said, Sephora, the cost calculation changed about 5-6 years ago. And we saw it happen because we started winning tenders in open, technology-neutral tenders on price alone in many countries around the world, including South Africa, including Brazil, Mexico, the US, many other places around the world. And we realized we were actually competitive without any type of subsidy against fossil fuels. And since then, the kind of list of areas where that's the case has grown and grown and grown. And I remember about 5 years ago publishing our annual report, and we were kind of like, we've won. We finally reached this grid parity, and that's it. We're just going to win now, and we're just going to take over. And then 3-4 years later, we realized it's actually not so simple. And in fact, our last report, we called it internally Beyond LCOE because it's no longer economics that's holding us back. And the other thing that's changed is that 10 years ago, it was really hard to get finance. Now it's crazily easy in most places in the world. There's investors lining up, there's philanthropics. How many new facilities and funding facilities have been announced just in the last few days? And it's fantastic how the investor confidence has changed. We have companies that have IPO'd in the last few weeks and have been oversubscribed by 200 or 300%. So it's not a question of money in most places. It's a question of the regulatory scheme is not there, or there's no, nowhere to sell the electricity because the market is still balanced towards incumbent fossil fuels. So we need to start actually talking about doing things on the ground, do it in a very agile kind of way. And if I can make just one more comment, I mean, we talk a lot about the just transition, and we talk about cost, and we talk about, I mean, there are countries in the emerging market, in the developing world, that are contracting fossil fuel for 4 or 5 times the price or the cost of renewables. And they're buying fossil fuels in some cases that don't provide any local content, don't provide any local jobs. You'll all have seen these power generation ships that have landed in some countries and have landed big contracts. I mean, how does that make sense within the context of the just transition or talking about affordability? So there's other things going on. We see coal still being contracted in Asia with a complete lack of transparency in some markets. So there's more going on here. So we need to get the politics right urgently to make this happen. Otherwise, it still remains talk, and it still remains everything taking too long to actually have success.
Thank you, Ben. I love it when I'm not the most controversial person on the panel, so I really appreciate your interventions there. But Irene, we've heard about the need to bring the public along for social license, for communication, the need for good policy, and of course we know finance and technological innovation. But what I've really been inspired by in your work is the leadership and the vision. Many of the things you talked about, regenerative agriculture, etc. And can you give us a sense of what about the processes that you're seeing on just transition is giving you hope? What do you hope that other countries will see and take on?
That's a very interesting question. The work is just starting. And just transition, just the concept, is not easy to grasp, for developing countries that have been in the same, exploiting fossil fuels for this long. And so when you talk to people about, we now want you to change your livelihood, right? It's not an easy subject.
No.
And, today morning I was just giving an example of, if we tell the pastoralists in Africa to stop eating meat because of the methane emissions, and you tell them to grow crops in an area where the ecology is, supports rangeland ecosystem. I mean, this is not an easy subject. No. So the hope that we have is that we have examples in Africa where there's been renewables coming on board, increased, mixed, the energy mix is quite, it favors renewables, countries like Kenya. And in those situations, we have found microenterprises, sort of organically growing around, the solar mini high grade, the solar mini, sorry, mini grids and the micro mini grids, around small villages. So there is hope, but it will take time.
And supporting those local initiatives.
Exactly.
And that local entrepreneurship seems critical.
It is critical
in those regions. So we have only just scratched the surface here, but I want to thank each of our panelists for sharing some of your perspectives and your deep experience. This is a journey that we are all on. We've heard today the importance of inclusion as we transition workers and energy systems and economies away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. We know that the transition is feasible and affordable. The question is, how do we accelerate it in line with our aspirations for a stable climate system and the real needs of people and communities and enterprises around the world? Across each of these presentations, we've heard that a just transition is not just a technical issue, nor is it merely a question of transitioning workers directly employed in the fossil fuel industry, although that is, of course, a central issue. In order to have a managed decline of fossil fuel production and emissions, we're also going to need countries to cooperate, to share their stories and their lessons, and to stop growing the problem. As we heard this year at COP26 in many opening statements, we know we cannot achieve this transition if we continue to grow the problem by expanding oil, gas, and coal production. A truly just transition raises a host of issues related to energy access, new models of more decentralized energy systems, and wider challenges of socioeconomic development. It needs to be addressed holistically, and it will require a major scaling up of international cooperation and support if we're to do it in the time frame consistent with 1.5 degrees. Central to all of this is making sure people are at the heart of the transition and are included so that it meets their needs and contributes to a safer and cleaner future for us all. Thank you so much for this panel today and for all of your work in ensuring that that happens.